How did a visual illusion and fear lead Europe to believe in the existence of 3-meter-tall giants? In the 16th century, monarchs spent vast sums of gold on maritime expeditions.
The maps of that era were dotted with huge blank spaces, promising either riches or death.
Sailors set out into the unknown in search of spices, but often found only death by starvation. In this video, we'll show how one of the most enduring myths of the Age of Discovery came to be. It was a brutal race for control of the world and new resources.
Captains steered wooden ships through storms, guided only by the stars and primitive compasses.
The ocean forgave no mistakes, turning into a deadly trap for the unprepared. Supplies of food and fresh water on board dwindled with every mile traveled. In September 1519, 5 small ships set sail from the shores of Spain. The fleet, commanded by Ferdinand Magellan, ventured out into the open ocean to face the storms. The Spanish crown had invested enormous resources in this perilous expedition. The holds were packed to the brim with barrels of water, hardtack, and salted meat. Royal inspectors strictly weighed every kilogram of cargo before departure. The ships were to go months without calling at friendly ports. About 270 men of various nationalities and social classes boarded the ships. They were hardened mercenaries, united only by a thirst for profit and fear of punishment.
Magellan kept the exact route a closely guarded secret from his subordinates.
The admiral did not trust even his closest captains, fearing betrayal and Portuguese spies. But such secrecy quickly turned against the commander himself. Spanish officers began to openly protest his strange and incomprehensible orders. With each passing day on the open ocean, discontent among the crew only grew. Sailors whispered in corners, and distinguished captains plotted conspiracies behind the admiral's back. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the fleet sailed farther and farther south. In March 1520, the battered ships dropped anchor in the desolate San Julian Bay. The deep bay provided reliable shelter for the wooden vessels from the icy and Arctic winds. But all around lay only bare, frozen land without a single tree. Nothing edible grew in this hostile territory. The sailors had to set up camp in the icy wind, completely isolated.
The constant cold and meager rations became the perfect fuel for mutiny.
Soon, Magellan ordered even further cuts to the crew's food rations. This decision was the last straw for the discontented Spanish nobles. The captains launched an open mutiny and quickly seized 3 of the 5 ships. The expedition was on the brink of total collapse due to internal conflict. If the admiral had shown even a hint of weakness, he would have been killed immediately. But Magellan acted with lightning speed and extreme cruelty. His loyal men secretly boarded the mutineers' flagship at night. They struck first and killed the main leader of the armed conspiracy. The remaining mutineers, terrified, laid down their arms before the resolute admiral. Magellan publicly executed the ringleaders to restore the faltering discipline. After the bloody purge, the crew began preparing for a long and difficult winter. The sailors repaired the sails and built temporary shelters from the snow. The camp lay still, awaiting spring at the edge of the inhabited world. For months, not a single living soul appeared on the horizon, but soon this silence was broken by an event that would change history forever. For months, the Europeans had considered this frozen land completely empty and lifeless. Magellan regularly sent armed patrols deep into the mainland, but the soldiers returned empty-handed. The silence of winter days was broken only by the endless howl of the wind in the ship's rigging. The situation changed dramatically when a lone figure suddenly appeared on the horizon. The unknown man walked confidently toward the ship's anchorage, showing not a trace of fear.
The sailors dropped what they were doing and froze, staring at the strange visitor clad in coarse furs.
The Spaniards were struck by the man's immense height and unusual proportions. His face was painted with bright colors, and his feet were clad in massive fur moccasins. The conquistadors began beckoning him toward the camp with gestures, holding out shiny beads and mirrors. Soon, dozens more members of this mysterious tribe emerged from the steppe and gathered around the campfires. The Indians set up their huts directly opposite the anchorage of the 5 Spanish ships. A cautious and silent exchange of goods began between the two worlds. The Europeans traded cheap bells and steel knives for valuable fresh meat. In return, they received heavy, warm furs that saved the sailors from frostbite at night. Magellan saw these people merely as a useful resource for the survival of his exhausted crew. The Indians, meanwhile, studied the strange newcomers who had arrived in huge floating houses with curiosity. However, this fragile peace treaty could not last long. The records of the expedition's chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, grew increasingly fantastical with each passing day.
He described the locals as true giants, whose heads barely reached the Spaniards' waists.
Fear of the unknown and a desire for fame drove the sailors to exaggerate the facts. Ordinary tall warriors in voluminous furs were transformed in the pages of the diaries into mythical giants. Thus was born the myth of the Patagonians, which would later drive all of enlightened Europe mad. The harsh climate of the South had weeded out the weak for centuries, creating a tribe of incredibly resilient hunters. They were masters of bows and slings in the open spaces of the windswept steppe. Spanish soldiers eyed these powerful athletes, capable of enduring colossal strains, with trepidation. But Magellan made a fateful decision that instantly undid all diplomatic progress. The admiral ordered the forcible capture of several Indians to present them as a gift to the king. The treacherous capture of hostages instantly turned peaceful neighbors into fierce and dangerous enemies. Instead of allies and food suppliers, the expedition faced a guerrilla war on foreign soil. The captain's arrogance turned a peaceful winter camp into a bloody disaster. The situation in the camp was becoming critical due to food shortages and constant fear. Magellan saw the locals not merely as neighbors, but as living merchandise for the Spanish king. He decided to capture the giants at all costs and deliver them to Europe in chains. The admiral devised a cunning plan based on simple human curiosity. The conquistadors brought out heavy steel shackles and showed them to the Indians as rare, precious ornaments.
The Spaniards gestured for their guests to try on these shiny iron bracelets on their ankles.
The unsuspecting warriors allowed the locks to be fastened around their ankles. In that very moment, the mask of friendship fell away and the trap snapped shut with a clang of metal. The Indians flew into a rage, trying to break the chains with their incredible strength, but it was already too late. Winter began to recede, and the ice in the bay finally ceased to bind the wooden hulls of the ships. Magellan immediately gave the order to weigh anchor and continue the search for the secret strait. The exhausted sailors worked to the limit of their strength, suffering from scurvy and constant malnutrition. Discipline on the ships now depended solely on the fear of the gallows. The fleet resembled a powder keg that could explode from any accidental spark. As they left the shores of Patagonia, the ships carried not only captives, but also a dangerous lie. The chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, diligently recorded descriptions of giants of incredible stature in his diary. He deliberately embellished reality to turn an ordinary report into a global sensation. Thus, the real facts began to drown in an ocean of fabrications and literary exaggerations. But ahead lay a trial for the expedition that made the mutiny in the cold seem trivial by comparison.
The ships entered a gloomy and tangled labyrinth of rocks that today bears the captain's name.
But the greatest test of endurance awaited Magellan ahead, amid the icy waters of the unknown strait. The reality of the Strait of Magellan could have frightened even the most experienced and fearless navigator. In October, the ships finally reached a latitude where the coastline receded deep into the mainland. Before them lay not a straight path, but a tangled network of dangerously narrow and dark channels. Huge, gloomy cliffs loomed over the water, completely blocking the sailors' life-saving sunlight. The fleet began an extremely slow and cautious advance into this unknown territory. Navigating the strait required the captains to steer their heavy sailing ships with surgical precision. The entrance to this watery labyrinth became a point of no return for every member of the expedition. The 3 remaining ships stubbornly continued their journey through the cold and desolate fjords. The sailors remained at their posts for days on end, peering into the dark water in search of danger. Every mile of the journey took a tremendous toll on the crew, both physically and mentally. The icy waters around them were littered with sharp rocks capable of piercing the wooden hull in an instant. The harsh, natural environment of these parts seemed determined to hold these uninvited guests in its grip forever. After several weeks of grueling struggle, the fleet finally saw an open horizon ahead. The passage through the deadly labyrinth was complete, and the boundless ocean stretched out before the flagship. Magellan named it the Pacific because he had not encountered a single storm during the entire voyage. But this sudden calm was merely another cruel illusion on their bloody journey. The real ordeal for the entire expedition had not even begun yet. Once out in the open ocean, the ships were completely cut off from any means of replenishing their fresh water supplies. The men had stepped into a terrifying void, the true extent of which no cartographer in the world had ever known. Now, for thousands of miles around, there was not a single patch of land capable of offering them salvation. The land had finally vanished over the stern, leaving the sailors alone with the endless horizon. Entering the Pacific Ocean marked the beginning of the most terrifying ordeal for the entire crew. Day after day, the ships pressed forward, but not a single patch of land appeared on the horizon. Magellan and his navigators had made a catastrophic error in calculating the size of this ocean. The sailors had hoped to cross the water in a couple of weeks, relying on old, inaccurate maps. However, weeks turned into months, and all around them stretched only an endless blue desert. The scorching equatorial sun slowly turned the wooden decks into red-hot frying pans. The sails faded and tore in the wind, and the sailors had no strength left even for simple repairs. Without fresh vegetables and fruit, the men began to rapidly lose their teeth and strength. The fleet turned into a ghostly caravan, slowly drifting at the mercy of the currents and the wind. Navigation in this vast emptiness became a dangerous game of guessing the course by the stars. The instruments of that time did not allow for an accurate determination of how far west the ships had drifted. The captains sailed blindly, hoping to see land before the last sailor died. The Pacific Ocean turned out to be several times larger than all the land known at that time. This colossal geographical error turned into a veritable living hell for the expedition. The sailors ate sawdust and rats to somehow stave off their unbearable hunger. Discipline on board was maintained solely by the iron will of Ferdinand Magellan himself. The admiral remained ice-coldly calm, even though he could clearly see that food supplies had long since run out. He personally handed out to each sailor a tiny portion of rotten water and a handful of hardtack. The men obeyed their commander more out of habit than out of any hope of salvation. The crossing of this vast expanse of water took nearly 4 long months. During all that time, the exhausted men did not encounter a single island suitable for anchoring. The vast expanses of the ocean revealed to humanity for the first time the true scale of our planet. Old world maps were rendered completely useless after this voyage, but this great discovery was paid for with the lives of dozens of ordinary sailors. A brief stop at the first islands they found only slightly restored the crew's strength. Soon Magellan ordered the anchors to be raised and the ship to move on toward the Philippine archipelago. The sailors naively believed that all dangers and misfortunes were far behind them. They had no idea that they were entering a zone of bloody conflicts between local chieftains. Instead of a triumphant return, a series of fatal mistakes and betrayals awaited the expedition. The greatest tragedy of this journey was to unfold in the coming days. Arrival in the Philippines was a moment of greatest triumph for Ferdinand Magellan. He realized that he had accomplished the impossible and was the first in the world to reach Asia by sailing strictly westward. However, this colossal success suddenly went to the experienced navigator's head. Instead of quickly loading the ships with spices and heading home, he got involved in a foreign war. The archipelago was divided among warring local chieftains. Magellan formed an alliance with one of the rulers, promising to crush his enemies with cannons. This decision violated the expedition's primary objective, to preserve the crew and return to Spain alive. The fleet transformed from a scientific mission into a punitive expedition resolving local disputes. The Europeans had become overly confident in the invincibility of their steel armor and powerful muskets. The main enemy of the Spaniards was a chieftain from a neighboring island named Lapu-Lapu. He flatly refused to submit to the newcomers or pay tribute to the Spanish crown. Magellan took this refusal as a personal challenge to his authority and power. He decided to personally lead the attack to teach the rebellious Indians a bloody lesson. The admiral was absolutely certain that he could easily crush thousands of warriors with just a small detachment. He took with him only 60 sailors, armed with swords and firearms. Magellan even refused the help of local allies, wanting to claim all the glory for himself. This arrogance led the expedition to the most famous disaster in the history of navigation. The battle site turned out to be extremely unfavorable for the Europeans due to the shallow waters. Coral reefs prevented the heavy ships from getting close enough to the shore to fire on enemy positions. The soldiers had to jump overboard and wade knee-deep in water for a long time under a hail of arrows. Heavy metal armor dragged the sailors toward the bottom, preventing them from maneuvering quickly. Thousands of Lapu-Lapu's warriors surrounded the handful of Spaniards, showering them with spears and stones. Magellan fought in the front ranks, covering the retreat of his frightened men to the boats. He sustained several wounds but continued to fight back until the enemies knocked him into the water. The great navigator perished in the coastal mud before the eyes of his fleeing crew. The two remaining ships hastily weighed anchor and left those dangerous shores. They left behind not only their admiral, but also their belief in their own invincibility. Without a leader or a clear plan, the remnants of the crew drifted across the ocean in search of a way home. The conqueror's pride turned their triumph into a shameful flight on wrecked ships. The surviving sailors would have to accomplish the impossible to deliver the news of Magellan's death to Europe. But the most difficult trial awaited them on the return journey across half the globe. After the admiral's death, the fleet's retreat turned into a desperate race against death. The new captains understood that returning to Spain without valuable cargo would be a disgrace. They had to find the Spice Islands at any cost and fill their holds with the gold of the East. The ships wandered for a long time in the treacherous waters of Indonesia, lacking accurate maps and experienced pilots. Finally, the sailors reached the Moluccas and filled their holds to the brim with cloves and cinnamon. This cargo was worth a fortune and could fully recoup all the expedition's losses. But the condition of the ships themselves after 3 years at sea was simply catastrophic. One of them sprang a serious leak and had to be left for repairs off the coast of Asia. Only one ship set out on the final voyage home, the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano. Rounding the Cape of Good Hope proved to be the final ordeal for the old wooden hull. Huge waves nearly crushed the ship, and the pumps on board ran around the clock. The sailors collapsed from exhaustion, but continued to bail water so the ship would not sink. Their journey along the African coast was marked by constant fear of Portuguese military galleons. The sailors were ready to burn the Victoria rather than surrender their precious cargo to the enemy. They subsisted on nothing but rice and rainwater, afraid to set foot on land even once. It was an unprecedented test of human will in conditions of complete isolation from the world. When food supplies ran out entirely, Elcano decided on a dangerous stop near the Cape Verde Islands. This archipelago belonged to hostile Portugal, and any mistake could cost everyone their lives. The Spaniards tried to pass themselves off as simple merchants, but the Portuguese authorities quickly uncovered the deception. Part of the crew was immediately thrown into prison, and Elcano had to hastily abandon his comrades and set sail. The Victoria headed out to the open sea under the barrels of coastal cannons. The ship covered the final stretch to Spain with a handful of dying people on board. The sailors slept right next to the rigging, so they could pull the right rope at a moment's notice. The ship's planking had rotted so badly from water and time that it could be pierced with a knife. In September 1522, the Victoria finally entered its home port. Having completed the first circumnavigation of the globe in history, only 18 exhausted sailors out of the nearly 300 who had set out on the voyage made it ashore. But the cargo of spices in the holds more than paid for the construction of all 5 ships of the expedition. From a scientific standpoint, the voyage proved that the Earth is round and that all the planet's oceans are connected. However, along with cloves, these men brought legends to Europe full of frightening distortions. The most prominent of these was the myth of mysterious giants, which took root in the minds of Europeans forever.
The footprint measures nearly 6 centimeters. The claws alone are 10.
The return of the Victoria caused a real shock in 16th century European society. The stories of the surviving sailors instantly spread through port taverns and royal palaces. Tales of terrible famine and fabulous gold mingled with outright fiction. The sailors eagerly embellished their adventures to appear as heroes in the eyes of the crowd. The public was most interested not in the coordinates of the islands, but in the terrifying tales of unknown monsters. The main source of these rumors was the diary of Antonio Pigafetta, the expedition's official chronicler. His accounts were believed unconditionally, for he was one of the few who had completed the journey. Decades later, the famous pirate Francis Drake also visited those distant shores. His men confirmed that they had seen very tall and powerful warriors in the south. However, Drake noted that while the Indians were tall, they were by no means 3 meters tall. But the European public stubbornly ignored the truth, preferring to believe in the most terrifying giants. The voices of the few skeptics were completely drowned out by the general chorus of those seeking cheap thrills. Century after century, captains sailed through the strait bringing home increasingly wild tales. Some officers even reported bloody battles with real giants. Often such reports were simply an attempt to cover up their own navigational errors. It was much easier for commanders to blame the loss of men on mythical monsters than on starvation or storms. The terrifying myth became a convenient excuse for any failure or the death of sailors at sea. The legend of Patagonia turned into an impenetrable shield for incompetent admirals. The turning point in this story came only with the arrival of the first serious scientific expeditions. A new generation of researchers trusted only numbers and precise measurements, not sailors' tall tales. They landed on the shore with measuring instruments and pencils in hand. Scientists sought real facts, not ghosts from the past used to scare children. The clash between cold logic and ancient myth was merely a matter of time and persistence. This process of debunking the legend opened a new chapter in the history of our planet's exploration. The 18th century ushered in an era of scientists and a demand for strict precision. The British Admiralty began sending powerful ships to sea to compile detailed maps. The captains received a clear order to verify all the old legends and find those very giants. Commodore John Byron's expedition was the first to approach this issue with a ruler in hand. The sailors landed in Patagonia and began measuring the height of every indigenous person they encountered. It turned out that the average height of the local warriors was about 180 centimeters. To a Briton of that time, whose height barely reached 160 centimeters, the Patagonians did indeed seem very tall. But these were ordinary people, not the 3-meter-tall monsters from old sailors' tales. The illusion of gigantism instantly crumbled under the weight of ordinary mathematical data. However, a fate far more terrible than the loss of mythical status awaited the region's indigenous population. With the development of technology, Patagonia's isolation was finally broken by outsiders. New states, expanding their territories, began to lay claim to these boundless lands. The traditional hunting practices of the indigenous peoples began to interfere with the plans for a new economy and private property. A systematic and brutal displacement of the indigenous inhabitants from their ancestral lands began. The Europeans brought with them not only guns, but also deadly invisible diseases. The Native Americans' bodies had no immunity to common urban infections, which decimated entire tribes. The population began to dwindle rapidly, even without major battles or wars. Soon, the governments of the southern republics organized large-scale military campaigns deep into the continent. The goal of these operations was the complete subjugation of the wildlands and the establishment of strict control. Local warriors could no longer roam freely across the steppes, as their ancestors had done for centuries. They were forced to retreat to the most barren and inhospitable regions of Patagonia. A unique culture, which had survived in the harsh cold, found itself confined within the narrow boundaries of reservations. The great hunters became mere shadows on the fringes of the new civilization. Today, only dusty museum shelves and yellowed maps remind us of the giants of Patagonia. This story clearly shows how our fear of the unknown can distort reality. People tend to turn the incomprehensible into something frightening and supernatural. The real past always turns out to be far more complex and instructive than any beautiful legend. In the example of Magellan and the Patagonians, we see the price humanity pays for its great discoveries.
¡Aseguren las velas! ¡Duro a babor! ¡Cuidado con las rocas!
The first circumnavigation of the globe was a true test of endurance for humanity. Magellan's expedition proved that the Earth is one and that the oceans are connected by endless routes. But this success came at the cost of nearly 300 lives and the crew's unspeakable suffering. The myth of the Giants of Patagonia became a classic example of how mass delusions are born. A single word from a chronicler, seized upon by a Europe hungry for sensation, made captains fear ghosts. Sailors wasted precious strength and resources preparing for encounters with imaginary monsters. The Philippine tragedy was the logical outcome of overestimating one's own strength and pride. Magellan decided to play someone else's political game, becoming a mercenary in the conflict between local tribes. The admiral's death in the coastal mud clearly demonstrated that even steel armor does not make men gods. The return of the battered Victoria finally put an end to the era of fear of the ends of the earth. The world ceased to be a collection of scattered islands and became a single battlefield for future conflicts. The globe transformed from a theoretical model into a real tool for conquest and trade. Behind the beautiful facade of geographical discoveries lay the harsh reality of survival. Civilization was driven forward not only by a thirst for knowledge, but also by cold calculation, hunger, and a lust for power. Scientific achievements often became merely a byproduct in the endless pursuit of new sources of profit. The evolution of our understanding of Patagonia is a journey from blind faith in miracles to rigorous science. Today, high-resolution satellites reveal every centimeter of those once frightening shores. We no longer need to invent monsters to explain the grandeur and harshness of nature. Magellan's real story turned out to be far more complex and instructive than any fictional legend. It teaches us that the most dangerous enemy is not an external threat, but our own ignorance. And even though the giants remain only in dusty archives, Patagonia itself still reminds us of the mistakes and heroism of the past. The local tribes that encountered Magellan's ships left an indelible mark on history. Their ability to survive for centuries in the harsh conditions of Patagonia deserves sincere respect. They were not mythical giants, but possessed incredible adaptability and fortitude. Their tragic fate became an integral part of the process of shaping our modern world. The memory of these people and their struggle is far more important than any fantasies once conjured up by frightened sailors. Objective truth matters more here than beautiful but empty legends. Studying the past requires us to be constantly ready to question old, convenient truths. One need only dig deeper beneath the beautiful tales to uncover the harsh and grim reality of that time. Magellan's story is not only a triumph of the spirit, but also a chronicle of a constant struggle against hunger and death. It is a story of how human ambition collides with the limits of what is possible at the edge of the earth. The ocean still holds many secrets that await their time, and a calm, scientific gaze. We will continue to unravel the hidden pages of history to separate real facts from layers of myth.